Now, so many people that she was contemporaries with, who were her contemporaries, whether early on or later on in her life, she saw them be cut down in the prime of their lives. You mentioned Dr. King, of course, who was assassinated on her 40th birthday, and of course, then Malcolm X. Before that, even international figures like Patrice Lumumba, each of them was a blow to her,
That's
as
right.
would one can only imagine. How did she deal with death? How
Yeah.
did she, what were the lessons that we can learn from her about how we can handle death?
That death doesn't have the last word. One, how we live our lives every day is what we control. We don't control death. It comes to each of us. And so that's a fight that Maya wasn't willing to have. She says in her own words, I surrendered that fight a long time ago. Because what is going to happen will happen when it's supposed to happen. What I control is how I live my life every single day. And what I'm not going to allow to happen is for misery to have the last word. Misery is not going to have the last word. And so it's really about how we choose to live every day. She reminded me consistently that choices have futures. Every choice has a future. And so we choose how we live our lives. And this is something I've come to consider. This is not a lesson that Maya taught me, but in hanging out with her, I've come to accept this as my own philosophy about death, which is that our work becomes our afterlife. Our work becomes our afterlife.
Right.
So if we do high quality work, we never really die because our ideas, our art, our contributions go. We're still talking about Beethoven all these years later. We're still talking about Shakespeare all these years later. And years from now, we'll still be talking about Maya Angelou. Can I have the book just for a second?
Yes.
I want to just read, if I can.
Yes.
This I chose this piece personally to go on the back of the book. When you publish a book with a major company, there people have ideas about how things ought to be laid out, and typically on the
You
back
must
of
have
a
glimpsed at my questions because I literally have a note here asking you to read that out on
oh,
the show.
I did not glimpse at it. My eyes aren't quite that good. But
Perfect.
your question about
Yeah.
death brings me, you see why,
Yeah.
brings me to this passage. And so we had a conversation at the book company about whether or not we were going to put blurbs on the back of the book from people embracing and touting the book. And I said, no, I don't really need that. Maya's life speaks for itself. We don't need blurbs on this book. What I'd rather do is to put this passage from the book on the back of the book. And here's what it says. I don't know how I knew this, Tavis, but in the deepest part of my soul, I understood that the adventure itself required courage. And because I didn't want to miss out on the fun, I didn't want to deny myself the sheer joy of going through this human form with all its heartaches and joys. I simply did what was required. I mustered up the courage to forge ahead. Because of that, I have lived the life that I wanted to live. And so can you, Tavis. So can everyone. What she's saying, obviously, is if we muster up the courage to make the tough choices, each of us can live the life that we want to live. She told me, you can do that, Tavis, and so can everyone else.
I'm wondering, Tavis, she passed away just before the spark of the Ferguson protests were lit last summer, and we seem to today be at a moment of heightened awareness of the problems of racism in the United States. And since you knew her so well, I'm wondering if you would consider speculating how she might have seen this moment that we are in today, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example.
Well, speculate is a good word, but it's really not necessary because when you talk to people talked about people rather like Maya Angelou or Martin King, they lived through these occurrences in their own lives.
Yeah.
She lived through the Watts riots.
Yeah.
She saw the Newark uprisings. She saw the Detroit riots. Of course, we all lived through the Los Angeles riots. So this is not something we have to speculate about. She saw this and lived through it. I think both she and Dr. King believed that violence is both impractical and immoral. So that violence is not the answer to our crises and to our problems. On the other hand, because she loved young people so and loved seeing them engaged, she would absolutely be celebrating the advocacy of these young people for justice and for fairness. And she'd make a distinction between, charity and justice. There are a lot of people who are engaged in philanthropy and think that all we have to do is give a little money here, do a little, a little charity work here. But justice is a very, very different situation and issue. And so she'd be absolutely celebrating the fact that these young people are finding their voice, are making their way in the world, are trying to make the world better when they leave it than when they found it. That's a beautiful thing to see young people engaged in that way. It is the reason why she moved to Winston-Salem to teach at Wake Forest. She loved young people. I'm exhibit A of what happens when she comes into contact with a young person whose mind she finds to be fertile. She wants to feed that. She wants to support that. She saw herself as a gift that she wanted to share with other people. And so I suspect that were she here now, she'd absolutely be celebrating the advocacy of these young people, but again, telling them to behave and to work in ways that would not be counterproductive.